I'm Mark Bouris, and this is a special live event of Straight Talk hosted by the Sydney Roosters Business Club. G'day, everybody. Thanks very much for coming along. We've been trying to put this together for pretty much 2 years now. COVID has got in our way a number of times, and on every occasion, Peter has been very generous with offering his time, but we keep running into obstacles and hurdles. But here we are today, and I appreciate everybody's patience with this. And welcome to a Straight Talk podcast. This is our very first live audience podcast, and welcome to Peter Liondis.
Thank you, Mark.
Very much. So I'm extraordinarily curious about this guy. I want to know where he was born and where he grew up.
Well, I was actually born in Kythera in Greece, and I was born in the house. And to this day, I don't know what day I was born because firstly, I used to celebrate my birthday on the 14th of May. And then when I came to Australia, I discovered on the passport the 17th of May. So I said to my mother, when was I born? She said, I don't know. It's either the 14th or the 17th because you're born at home. So luckily it's the same star sign. So I'm not, so I've got the biggest birthday celebration there is. But I think in Greece, it probably took 3 days to register. So it's probably the 14th rather than the 17th.
It's funny, my dad's exactly the same thing. My dad's passport says born on the 23rd of January, but he celebrates his birthday on the 13th of January because his mother told him he was born on the 13th of January in Greece. And usually what it was is the day they got you registered at the church.
Right.
And your mum would have given birth to you and would have had to wait until she was well enough to walk up to the church to register your birth. And that's probably what happened.
And she says, what does it matter? 14th, 17th, doesn't matter. But it means a fair bit to me.
Yes, particularly if you're curious. And what age did you come to Australia?
So I was 3, and we were the typical migrant family. We came out on the Patrice, which was a big liner, and it took 30 days to come to Australia. And I actually was very sick on the cruise because I had a bleeding nose and wouldn't stop bleeding. And there's a lot in other sports that wish that I did bleed to death, but I didn't. So I am here. So that's what I really remember the most is being in the boat hospital most of the time coming out. And the one thing that really amazes me every time I see it is when we came into Sydney Harbour, it was all the lights and even to this day, there's something mystical about when I see all these lights on the harbour.
That's quite interesting. And obviously, you've probably never been on a ship before. Did you go via the Suez?
Mate, I wouldn't know where I don't remember where we came from. I think it was through the Suez, but look.
You wouldn't remember?
I wouldn't remember, no.
But in those days too, I'm sure you weren't sort of in the presidential suite or sort of sitting up the top in some sort of with a beautiful balcony and all that sort of stuff. You're probably down in the bowels of the ship, which is probably another reason why you weren't feeling too flash 30 days on a ship going at sea. When you arrived in Australia, where'd you guys go to?
So look, my auntie first came out to Australia and they, as a typical Greek family, they opened up a cafe in Wollongong called the Central Cafe, and it was very well known actually because they had the best hamburgers in Wollongong. So my father came out 12 months before we did and left my mum and my 2 brothers back in Greece. And so he came out and got a job, bought a house, a very modest home, but certainly a good investment now. And then we came out 12 months after he did, and my mother worked in the cafe, and my dad then worked at the steelworks. And he was one of these, probably where I get my work ethic from. He'd go to work at 6 o'clock. You're supposed to finish at 3 o'clock. But in those days, they used to be called doublers. So you'd go from 3 o'clock to midnight, and then you'd go back the next day at 6. So he was a very hard worker. And my mother, she would start work at 7 o'clock and finish at 8 o'clock at night. So we didn't see our parents, very much. So we sort of had to fend for ourselves. So, that's probably a part of my makeup now is that, for most of my life, I've had to, look after myself.
That's very interesting. I had similar sort of background. So, and people say to me, you work too hard. But I say, I don't think I do. I mean, it's just what I do. It's how I live my life. I'm not obsessed with work. It's just what I saw as a kid growing up, and I just adopted that process. Do you feel as though at any stage, because I've read legendary stories about how hard you work, and you're a chairman of lots of different institutions. You're always doing charitable stuff. You've got to go to events. Your work ethic, as I said, is of legendary status. Do you feel it is that way, or you have an obsession with this, or is this just what Peter Liondis does?
I think it's just what Peter Liondis does. It's a necessity. It's not that I want to do it, but if you want to get the outcome, you've got to put the work in, and it's as simple as that. No one gets an outcome by not working or going it the hard way, in my view. If you want to be lazy and do nothing, you get nothing. If you want to work hard, no matter what your ability is or your intelligence, you will always get an outcome, and that's how I've been. But plus, I saw my mother and my father work 14-hour days, and I worked from the age of 8 myself. So I used to work 8-hour days, stacking the cafe chips and cigarettes, and I remember making thick shakes for Steve Rogers, who was a legend in rugby league at the time. And so I learned from a young age that you have to work hard to get to where you are. I bought my own car with my own money. I sent myself through university because I didn't want my parents to do it, because I saw how hard they worked to make the money. So it was up to me to do the same thing.
So were you conscious that you came from a working class family and or a migrant family? Was that a thing you were quite conscious of, or were you immune from all that given where you grew up in Wollongong?
Very conscious of it. And at first, which I really feel ashamed, is you didn't want to be that family. You were embarrassed about that family. In trying to assimilate with the Aussie kids, you didn't want them to know that your father was a wog and your mother was a wog in a cafe. You tried to avoid it as much as you could. And now I'm so proud of it. It's the complete opposite.
It's funny that when you say a wog, and a lot of people here in terms of age group might not have experienced that, some would have. What did you I experienced the same stuff. So I grew up in Punchbowl, went to school in Lakemba. There were either Lebanese, Greeks or Aussies, and you sort of copped a fair bit because of what you had in your lunchbox, for example. It might have been melasana or something else, like some Greek food from the night before you had in your box, which, by the way, everyone loves today. Everybody loves today, but
they didn't back then, though.
They didn't. If it wasn't Devon and tomato sauce on a sandwich, which I used to ask, can I get that? I used to ask Mum, no way, you're not having that, no way. What defined you as a wog? Was it the way you ate? Was it the way you looked? Was it your surname, or what was it?
Look, it got to a point where I wouldn't take my lunchbox. I can really relate to what you're saying, because they'd always stir you about your lunchbox, and so in the end I didn't take it. I prefer not to eat than to be picked on it. But for me it was even harder because my parents couldn't afford childcare, and there wasn't much childcare then anyway. So they sent me to school a year. They lied about my age, and I've been lying about it ever since. So I went to school at probably 3.5, and I was in the playground, couldn't speak English, you couldn't really assimilate with anyone. So you got naturally picked on. I was the smallest kid. I was just a complete easy mark for somebody, and that's what it was. So it was very, very, I dreaded going to school, and I had to do something about it, because it was either do something and survive or perish, basically. And that's where sport comes into it. And that's why sport, in my view, is so important for kids to assimilate with other people. It gives you friends for life. It gives you purpose. And that's why I'm in rugby league, is to repay the debt because it was rugby league that got me in with the Aussie kids. So, I started playing with them, became mates, and then I would try my hardest in the game. So I was part of them, so I wanted to be beneficial to them rather than just this wog kid that couldn't speak English. I wanted to, I used to tackle everything that moved. I used to tackle the parents if they got in the way. And, the orange boy at halftime, I'd tackle him. So that was what I did when I first started playing, was just tackle, because you didn't need any ability to do that. You just stuck your head in anywhere it goes and your arms around their legs and bring them down. And so for me, the saviour early in my childhood was sport, and in particular rugby league, and later on actually racing too, because racing's been a big part of my life as well.
So at what point do you think, you're a 3-year-old boy, 4-year-old boy, 5-year-old, and you just go and keep playing footy, going to school. At what point does someone like you become conscious of what sport did for you?
It didn't hit me at the time. All I knew at the time was that I wasn't being called a wog anymore, or I wasn't bashed up, to me, it was all about survival. What you do to want to go to school, what do you do to avoid them? I used to get on the bus and and all the eyeballs were on you, and you were dreading someone yell out, "Sit down, you wog." That's the fear. There was more fear and self-esteem and who you were, and so I guess at the time I just grabbed sport because it's the only thing I knew that I could possibly become, part of the Australian gang, I guess, in a sense.
Sport is a great equaliser. Have you taken any of those feelings or any of those experiences growing up as a kid into what you tried now to pay forward for young men and women in the two sports that you represent? But let's talk about rugby league.
Absolutely. And the one that really hit me the hardest since coming to rugby league is the Indigenous kids. I thought I did it tough. They do it a lot tougher than me. And Wayne Bennett told me a story which I think sums it up. And it was Latrell Mitchell. He asked Wayne to go up to Taree with him. So he goes up to Taree and he disappears for about 45 minutes. And he comes back with about $500 worth of fish and chips, takes them in the middle of the park, and hundreds of Indigenous kids ran to have the fish and chips. And Wayne said to Latrell, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Well, that was me. That was me one day. This is the light at the end of their tunnel, is to have sport." And in particular, I think the Indigenous community, that's the one hope they have is to play rugby league or that other horrible game. I think it's called FL or something, AFL or something. So that they want to succeed in, and that sort of helps me a lot. But also, any new migrant kid that comes in will do it tough. Like it or not, our society has still got a level of racism where people are treated differently. And look, and I don't blame the Aussie kids when I was young, because they were intimidated just as much as I was intimidated by them. They were intimidated by me. They didn't know who I was. They didn't, who's this kid coming from some other country into their country? So, yeah, look, I'd like to see the Indian kids and the Asian kids play rugby league, and that's one of the real ambitions I have, is to get those kids to play rugby league, because you don't see many Indian kids playing rugby league, you don't see many Asian kids playing rugby league. When Mastri, I can't say his name, the Lebanese winger for the Bulldogs, once he came in,
Hazem
Mastri, he developed a new beginning for Lebanese kids in the Bulldogs, and now you go there, that's the fan base. So we'll need to do the same for all our cultures in Australia. We're all one, And the one thing I learnt, and I try my hardest, and it is, you've got to try your hardest in doing it, is to always be respectful and nice to people, because everyone has got a self-esteem. There's no reason to be mean or nasty or unkind to somebody. And so I try my hardest in anything I do to respect that person, no matter who they are. And I'll give you a little story which I think shows you what an outcome you can get if you have that philosophy in treating everyone the same. And I've been very lucky to meet prime ministers and princes and all that sort of stuff, but I treat the cleaner exactly the same as I would treat the Prime Minister of Australia, and I think that's very important. And I'll tell you how it came back to me. When we wanted to start the game on the 28th of May, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, there were some difficult times. And the last hurdle was the referees were going to go on strike because we were going to go back to one referee. We didn't consult them, etc. And the mistake I made is I didn't communicate with them. So one day I called all the referees in and spoke to them and convinced them that, we're on the right track. But then about 2 or 3 weeks later, I got a letter from one of the referees who said to me, it was me that convinced him to go back, he said in his letter, because I will never forget that 25 years ago, you gave me a chance as an Indigenous kid to be a cleaner. And more so, you treated my father like a king who was a cleaner that worked for you. He said, you're the only CEO that ever went to a funeral of a cleaner. And he said, I told the referees that's what you were like. And that's what got them started. So being respectful to anyone does have its benefits, in essence. I didn't expect that. And I don't do it for that reason. I just do it because that's what I want to be treated like. And that's what I hated the most growing up, was how mean and nasty people can be. And that's why it amazes me with social media that these people get on these platforms and they're nasty and they're mean and they're horrible. And I just don't know what gets into them to be like that, So I think for all of us, I think the lesson is, treat everyone with the same respect that you want to be treated as.
But that's interesting. You're sort of saying that was more an instinct than a strategy. But often instincts, we actually grab hold of them and we put them into our strategy basket. Now, you're a leader, and leaders must have strategies to run an organisation. Do you use now those old instincts that worked well, which you learnt about growing up, seeing your parents, whatever? Do you actually try to impart those as strategies within the organisations which you lead?
Look, I'm a person that believes that you learn something every day. So all my life I've learned something, and I learned from my parents, I learned from school, I learned from... So you're really whole life is a bunch of experiences, and you put those experiences together to develop who you are. And I guess it develops the strategies that you do as well. So yes, look, it's life lessons that I've learned over time. And probably the one that I adapt to the most is I like people around me that I can do. I say to my staff, give me 5 reasons why you can do it. Don't give me 5 reasons why you can't, because I'm not interested. Everything is possible if you want to put the effort into it. So all my staff in racing have been with me the whole time there, because they're all can-do people. They want to, and they get rewarded at the end of it. So to me, it's all about getting a particular outcome, and whatever experience you need to take from life in getting that outcome, you just grab it from your basket and implement it.
So you became the typical migrant kid, went through school down in Wollongong, played footy, you sort of integrated, etc. Then you went to university, typical migrant move, send the kid to university. I don't want my kid to work in the steel factory. In my case, my dad worked in a metal factory. Don't want my kid to work in a metal factory. My mum dragged me to university, enrolled me. I didn't want to go. Get your degree. How'd you end up in racing in New South Wales?
Well, it was quite interesting because my grandparents passed away very early, and I never saw them again once we left Greece. And one of my friends, who happens to be, name is Wayne Pearce, not the same Wayne Pearce that plays rugby league, but a different Wayne Pearce. He lived across the road from this 2 older people that owned horses. And so I used to go over there on a Friday night when Harold Park Trots were on and watch the races with him, and was absolutely absorbed by his stories about racing, etc. So I started punting from the age of about 9. So I'd go down to the local TAB, I would get somebody that was 18 to place the bets. The only problem I had was that every time I won, he took a cut. So I learned about the tax department very early in the piece. So I used to call him the tax man. But I used to win, and it was quite weird. And so I used to spend my Fridays and Saturdays watching the races, and so I had an ambition to get into racing at some point in time. And I was 26 at the time, and they advertised for a new, back in those days, called the general manager of Harold Park. And I thought I had no chance of getting it, but I thought, geez, why not put in for it and for the experience? So I went up there and basically did a lot of homework as to what they were doing wrong and told them what they were doing wrong. And then never heard anything about it. And then six weeks later, this harness racing driver comes in and says, oh, here, you've got the job as general manager of Harold Park. And I hadn't even been told at that particular point in time. So I was the youngest ever CEO of a metropolitan race club. And I was fortunate in a sense because they were going backwards. They'd lost $1.5 million. They used to have the greyhounds there at the time, and they used to get $800,000 a year rent. They lost them. So I was about $3 million behind before I even started. And it was the chairman's last year. And he said, look, we can't show $1.5 million loss. Can you do some creative accounting and hide a bit of it and carry it forward to the next year? And being a loyal person I was, yeah, no problem. So I carried another $1 million into the next year, not realising that was my first year as the CEO. And I've got another I've got to wear another $1 million. So over the time we got the club back in making a profit, and it used to do some stupid things like, just to give you an example of how bad it was run, they used to pay all the staff that used to come in the evening before they started work. So they'd all go in, get their money. So I followed one, and I followed him, and I kept going. I nearly ended up on the number 33 bus because he just went straight home. He didn't even work, and there was probably 4 or 5 of them, they'd collect their money, easy. It's like an ATM machine, except it was a human one, and they'd give you the money and they'd go. So the first thing I did was everyone got paid after the event by electronic means. And so that's how badly they were run. They used to take the mail in a chauffeured limousine, or they used to go to the bank in a chauffeured limousine, and they wondered how they made a $1.8 million loss. So I've always tried my hardest never to get rid of staff. I've always made it to be more efficient, do things in a more cost-effective way. You can do that thing exactly the same way for half the price. So that's the culture that I've implemented to all my staff, is that if some of my staff actually catch buses to meetings, or they catch a train to a meeting rather than getting a cab, because that's because it's the culture in their head that we do things cost effectively. You do them in a way where you get the best return. So that's what we implemented at Harold Park, and I was there for 15 years, and we became an entrepreneurial club because we had several businesses that I started up at the time, so we didn't have to rely totally on our revenue from racing. And Harold Park was a bit of an institution on a Friday night, so we made it a must place to be. And the promotion that I did that was the most successful was a thing called 10 for 30. So you'd paid $10 and you got $30 in Harold Park money with my head on it rather than the Queen's. And then you'd spend that $30. And my board said, "You're mad, you're giving all this money away." I said, "No, because they're going to run out on their $30 and then they're going to pay our 300% margin on our drinks. And, like when you buy a drink, it's a 300% profit margin on it." And so basically, once they ran out of money, they're going to, and sure enough, it was our most profitable night, and it got it's got a bigger crowd than we used to get for our feature race meetings, and they were all the younger demographic. They were all university students. And in their head, they thought they were getting value. For the $10, they were getting 30, but they spent the 30 in about half an hour, and then we're using their own money. But what I found from it, and I've implemented it later, is that they came back. So it was like, rather than paying $30,000 and putting that on TV, give the money to the person to enjoy, and then let that person promote you word to mouth. And that's exactly what happened. So on those Friday nights, we were jam-packed with university students, but 25% of them used to come back on other nights because we only did it once a month. And they became regular customers or engaged customers from that night. You sort of attract them, and then you've got to transform them into regulars. And it's the same thing with rugby league to a certain extent. You've got to get a viewer that's a casual viewer and turn him into an engaged viewer, turn him into a tribal viewer. And that's why we've introduced the rule changes to make the game more entertaining and to get that casual viewer. And it's worked because at the moment we have the highest TV ratings we've ever had for rugby league. And I think it's because we've made the game a little bit more entertaining than what it was. It wasn't, it was too predictable. It was too, one-dimensional. And I think that's an important lesson for business, in my view, is don't rely, don't be complacent. You always need to improve your product, no matter what the product is. Demographics change and people's tastes change, and there's a lot more competition for that disposable dollar. So you need to completely innovate your product, keep it up with the current market trend. Otherwise, and there's so many sports that I've seen, so many businesses, and I'm sure everyone's heard the story of Kodak. Now, Kodak was the first company to have the digital camera, but it had a massive business on film. So it put the digital camera away, not wanting to, lose its film business. And then some other company found the digital camera, and where's Kodak now? It's in receivership. It didn't survive. Who's got a film camera now? Nobody. And that lesson really sunk in my head in any business I do, is that don't rely on what the current trend or taste is. Always have young people around you and ask them what they like, what their trend is. And that's what I do in my current roles, is I have a lot of young people telling me what they, what is Snapchat and what is TikTok and what is all these things, because you need to learn about them, you need to know about them, and you need to embrace them. Otherwise, you're yesterday's person.
Well, that's very interesting. That's a form of staying relevant, particularly as we get older and we sort of occupy senior roles. one of the things I found quite interesting, and for those people in this room who don't know this, being in Greek sort of culture, people who come from Kythera are known as the best business people coming out of Greece. And of course, Nick Politis is a Kytherian as well. And in fact, Peter was telling me earlier that his mother comes from the same village as Nick.
Yeah, it does.
And his mother and Nick look similar.
Yeah, I thought they were Tasmanian for a minute. They were, it was quite weird because everyone, when I got into rugby league, said, he's Nick Politis' man. They're from the same. I had never met Nick. I think I passed and brushed him once, sort of casually saw him, but never knew him. And I only really met him once. I got in to become a commissioner on the ARLC. And, Nick, he takes to that little cafe in the corner there, and I looked at him, I thought, geez, I'm looking at my mother. Like, he looks very, very, very much the same. And they are from the same village. And that village has only got 200 or 300 people. There's 2,000 people in Kythera, and there's 150,000 in Sydney. So you can see they became rabbits once they got to Sydney, but and there's even more in Melbourne. So and yes, look, George Lucas, who is the founder of Star Wars, I think he's a Kytherian. George Miller, who did Mad Max, he's a Kytherian. You got Nick Politis. For an island that's only got 2,000 people, it has had an enormous amount of. We've had Supreme Court judges, very powerful business people. So it's certainly a good place to come from.
Well, my dad says in Greek, I won't say it, but he said, the Kytherians, they jump over the gate to save the hinge. He said they're very cost efficient. And it's funny, Peter was talking about cost efficiency. It's one thing just to talk about it, say that's an ideal, great. But what's really interesting is that you do what I think is really important, is that you actually go out and find where the cost can be saved. In other words, you follow home the person who was getting paid before the event occurred to see exactly what happens. In other words, you're quite happy to step down from your position and get into the weeds and do your research so that you're not only relying on other people's views, but you can actually see for yourself firsthand. And I think that probably comes from maybe how you're brought up, being prepared to be work in a fish and chip shop or work in wherever you had to work and do your 8 hours a day and pack the shelves with whatever it is you're packing the shelves with. Do you think that impact that your youth had on you, and therefore your ability to be very cost effective or cost efficient, is that something that you try to drum into all the people who work in your environments as the so-called a leader of those businesses? Is that something? Do you drum that into them, or do you try to select or recruit people who have that view in the first place?
No, I think you've got to develop a culture, and rather than having, you need to have a culture of cost effectiveness. In that, you have to think twice when you buy something or do something, and so I don't drum it into them. I just lead by example. So when I got on the ARLC, I caught the train from the airport to the city rather than getting and when you lead by example, people see it, and then they act on it. And it's quite remarkable really how easy it is to develop that culture when you lead by example. So when I was at Harold Park, I went to the stables and mucked out the stables. So I wanted to show them that I'm not that good that I can't go and collect the horse poo like they do. So I knew how long they would take to clean the horse poo too. So
did you bag it and sell it?
No, we didn't. I wish I knew that at the time, Mark. I probably would have, but no. I worked in the judge's box. I worked in doing the away prices. So I did everything that the staff did to show them that I'm one of them. I'm not elitist. I'm not, up myself. I'm just basically one of them. So, and they look at it, if it's good enough for him to be cost effective, it's good enough for me. And that's how I install it into, is you do it by example and by leadership, in that they see that if you're doing it, well, they've got to do it too.
It's very clever, and there's no point you doing that though unless they become aware of it. So if you're catching the train or the tram or wherever it happens to be, mucking out the stables, if they don't know about it, then that is of no benefit to you whatsoever, or no benefit to the business whatsoever. And as I said earlier, some of your exploits are, in terms of work ethic, are somewhat legendary. Like the time you get up in the morning, you're holding like major positions in major sporting organisations. I often think, how the hell does he do both of them at the same time? How do you get people to know about it, or do you just hope that it's going to seep out into the system? How do you tell people about it? Do you get on Instagram and say, here I am, photograph?
No, look, I guess people see the emails coming at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, very good. That's it.
So, everyone says, why are you sending me an email at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning? So I said, that's when I start work. That's when I have to start work. And one of the things I felt guilty about doing the rugby league was I didn't want to let racing down. I wanted to make sure that I spent the same amount of time, the same effort, the same in racing as I did in rugby league. So the way you do that is you've got to get up earlier and work later and work on weekends. But during COVID, it was probably the greatest gift for me to have both sports, because it gave us power. Having the both of them sort of alerted governments and et cetera. And racing did not stop during COVID. And if I had my time again, rugby league wouldn't have stopped. I was manoeuvred in stopping it, which I regret now, but we should never have stopped. But so it's all about time management and how you do it. But people, when you muck out a stable, the word gets around pretty quick. When you're working in the judges box, they all know you're up there. When you're working on the admission gates, they know you're there because they're the same people that are in there week out. And I'm a big believer of word to mouth, and that gets around as quick as, very quickly. And it amazes me how that culture is installed in the staff. Like if you go to Racing New South Wales now, it's the complete opposite to was when I first started, where I'll give you an example. They used to get a courier to collect the mail, and it used to cost $80,000 a year. Now, that's okay, but it was 100 metres up the road. So what we did is we said, well, let's put an extra staff member on, get the benefit of it. They can collect the staff, and it was half the cost. It's just little things like that, so today, they take it in turns in Racing New South Wales, who goes and mails or goes to the bank, it's all part of like a roster system. So, and that culture has been installed from that to this in very quick time, because again, at that stage, racing was battling, and we were costing a lot of money as an administrative body, and we had to bring it down so we can return the money to the participants. Or if you're a public, the way I look at racing or rugby league is we're the body that generates the revenues, puts the revenues together, but our participants or our clubs in rugby league are our shareholders. So if I'm the public company, I want to maximise my dividends to the shareholders. If I'm very costly up here, well, I'm minimising my dividends to the shareholders. And without the shareholders, without the people putting on the show, you don't have anything. So you've got to make sure that they always stay viable and vibrant and fully funded. And that's what I've really concentrated on in both racing and rugby league, is to fund the people that put on the event.
It's interesting. We talked about cost and cost efficiency, but on the flip side of that is innovation. And a lot of times people assume innovation comes with a great deal of cost. But you've managed to be able to balance the two perfectly, and you've kept your costs in control, and at the same time done a lot of really innovative things. And I just want to cut through some of these innovative things pretty quickly. I mean, you took on Victorian racing. You saw there was a market there to be taken on for New South Wales racing, and you've created huge amounts of prize money and revenues for New South Wales racing, as opposed to what they used to own in Victoria. You've now sort of usurped them in some respects. So what's your greatest achievement in that regard in New South Wales racing? Look,
I think there was two things. I think my greatest achievement was race field legislation. And what I mean by that is that racing depends on wagering, people having a bet. We're not a tribal sport where you watch it because you like a particular horse. You watch it because you've had a bet on that horse, and hopefully you're going to win on that horse. And what happened was we got these new bookmakers that domiciled themselves in the Northern Territory and weren't paying the racing industry to use the product. And money was migrating away from the traditional wagering operators, which was the TAB, to these wagering operators domiciled in the Northern Territory. And our revenues dropped dramatically because of it. So we had to do something. So when I started at Racing New South Wales, I went to Allen's and I got a 200-page legal opinion on enforcing copyright. And back in those days, there was a famous court case between Telstra and a little software manufacturer they reproduced the yellow pages or the white pages, I can't remember which one, on a disc, and Telstra sued them. And the court found that anyone that uses skill and labour has the copyright. And so I had 200 pages of legal advice to show how we were producing all that information to get the end result. Now, in the end, the Telstra lost in the High Court because it was found that they didn't use skill and labour to compile the white pages because it was all done by a computer. But in racing, we definitely did. We name the horse, we register the horse, we handicap them, we place a jockey. There's 200 pages worth of processes. So someone said, "Oh, Peter, don't enforce copyright. That's going to take you years in the court. Go and see the government and get what they call racefield legislation and let the government take the bookmakers on." I thought, geez, that's a good idea. And again, never do it the easy way, see? So I went to government, got the racefield legislation, and sure enough, all the bookmakers challenged it. And we were 3 years in the federal court and then ended up in the High Court. And I got the vibe that we were going to win, just like the castle. And we won unanimously. And that generates $1 billion a year now to both sport and racing in just in Australia alone. So it was a game changer for not just for us, but for everybody. And that was probably one of the toughest time in my career because I was taking on these giants from internationally of wagering operators. And their strategy was just to personally attack me. And I remember interviewing this young kid that wanted to work at Racing New South Wales, and he said, "Oh, I feel sorry for Mr. Liondis." He said, and my staff said, "Why would you feel sorry for him? He's look after himself." He said, "Oh, no." He said, "When I was working for the wagering operators, he said, any spare moment we had to make things up about him and put it online, and just..." And it got to the point where I hated myself. It was that bad. Like it was, it used to, but I knew I was doing the right thing, and I knew our survival depended on it. And as much pressure as there was, in not pursuing it, I did, and we got the rewards. And without it now, there wouldn't be a racing industry because we wouldn't have been able to be funded. After that, I guess, is the Everest. Now, the Everest is an idea that came away from the Kodak example, I guess, in a sense that young people don't want to do what their parents do. So the Melbourne Cup was the parents' event. We all grew up with the Melbourne Cup. I grew up with the Melbourne Cup. But the younger people, they want their own generational event. They don't want what their parents do. And I learned very quickly that once your parent went on Facebook, the kids went on Snapchat. Once they bought an Apple phone, they went to Samsung. They didn't want to do what their parents did. So I had to find something that was differentiated my product to the younger demographic. And it was the Everest. And I don't know how we did it, I've got to be honest, but it attracted the younger generation. And normally on a race meeting, we don't sell tickets because everyone waits till they get to the race course to see if it's raining and they buy the ticket at the gate. But we sold 22,000 tickets before, and 80% were under the age of 30. We had cashless bars, and we were monitoring who, through the data, who was there. And basically, the majority of the crowd that was at the bar was under the age of 30. So I used to get phone calls from, people wanting tickets. Now I get phone calls from parents wanting tickets for their kids. And that really, but the Everest had a bigger effect than that in the sense that you're right, Mark, in October, November, New South Wales racing didn't exist. All our race fields went down. Everyone just migrated to Victoria, and we were, so our revenues plummeted with it. But what I discovered, and I've only discovered more recently, is that not only did they go for the 2 months, they actually went for 6 months because they got used to betting on Victorian racing and they got used to being in that area. So it took a long time for us to get them back. With the Everest and then all the other races we've developed, our turnover's gone up 30-40% because the customers have stayed with us the whole time. They may go a little bit in Victoria, but they still stay in New South Wales. And our revenues have grown dramatically because of it. So that one event, the Everest, has really been a game changer for racing in this state because it's enabled us to get more money, more revenues, and we've put it in to other events. So the Kosciuszko, which is another one. We've got the new race on Melbourne Cup, or that other cup, on called the Big Dance at Randwick, which again, we're trying to attract the younger demographic. And what I've discovered since the Everest is when you go to the race meetings, 5 years ago, you'd go to a race meeting and everyone was over 50, over 60 years of age. That was the demographic. You go now and the demographic is under 25 to 30. And it's remarkable how it's changed. And it's changed because of one event called the Everest.
Which is similar to what you did in Harold Park.
Yeah, it was.
Very similar.
Very similar.
Much bigger scale, but very similar. In terms of rugby league, I mean, I know you went through the equine flu period and you had some experience with lockdowns, etc., when it comes to equine flu and the racing. But then when we had our lockdown, one of the things I remember is that you and the rest of the NRL appointed Wayne Pearce as the guy to run the whole show, obviously with instruction, etc., and a strategy. But then you also brought in a lot of really high-level experts. There was a doctor that you brought in who was the guy who built your COVID plan, your protocols. And what I saw from that is that and in fact, that particular doctor's been on my own podcast, and what I saw from that is what you do when you make a submission to government in order to allow rugby league to be played on under certain protocols, you find experts or people with high cred to support your argument. And when I step back, I see Peter Liondis really is very smart at surrounding himself in an innovative way with high-powered people. There's no skirting around the fact that you know high-powered people. You're in a high-powered job, but you know high-powered people. And you use high-powered people in the best possible way. What is your thinking about how important mixing or networking or mixing with the right people is in terms of getting what Peter Liondis thinks he needs to get for rugby league, for example?
Look, I think that was the secret of success, if the truth be known, in starting on the 28th of May. Wayne Pearce is a remarkable person, and he was the one that called it the Apollo. And the reason for that is JFK wanted to go to the moon, in whatever the year was, but the Apollo mission went earlier. So I said to him, we need to start before June, and we both picked the 28th of May, and I said, we can't look back, we've got to just do it on the 28th of May, and people were pushing us to go in June and July and August, but it was costing us $13 million for every week that we didn't play. That's what was costing us. And like it or not, the NRL did not have much money. The majority of the money it had was prepayments from the broadcasters. So if the broadcasters said pay us back, we were insolvent. So we had to do it out of necessity. So what I started to do was I followed the infection rate, and each day the infection rate came down, and I was emailing all the major decision makers, the Premier, the two broadcasters, anyone that I could think that I could argue with. I would send them the daily infection rates, and I just kept doing that. But the secret of the success, which I think got us back, is relationships, and they are so important. I have this room at Randwick called the Director's Room, and I call it the $1 billion room because it's generated $1 billion for us in so many ways. And what I do there is I bring the decision makers, both in politics, in media, and anywhere else, to that room. And you get to know them on a casual basis. You get to know them and they become your friends. And I never, ever speak business when they're there. I just want to entertain them, to have a good time. But in the back of my mind, I know one day I'm going to need them, or that relationship is going to, pay a dividend. So, in 10 years of running this director's room, I never called anyone for anything. COVID hits, I rang every one of them. And I got a result out of every one of them. I rang the editor of the Daily Telegraph, the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, anyone that I entertained, everybody, to get started on the 28th of May. And I genuinely believe if we didn't have those relationships, we would have been blocked. But having the major decision makers in the media ringing the politicians and etc. paid enormous dividends, and there's a lot of stories I could tell you, which I can't because we're filming it, how politicians changed their views very quickly when there was media pressure on them. And
you have been able to use that same process, from my observations, in terms of negotiating the new deal, the new broadcast deals, which you did during the COVID period. You've used the same process of bringing in powerful people, and even through whispers. You've become very good at this, the whole process, that is include using whispers. And whispers can be sort of pushed in through editors of newspapers, etc., or TV stations, etc., radio. You've been able to push these things through this very subtle processes of sending messages. It's sort of like sending messages through the media, but in a very subtle way, to coerce people into the view that Peter Liondis wants, which Peter Liondis is doing for the betterment of the game. It's not for Peter Liondis. You get nothing out of it. I mean, you get paid a wage, obviously, but you get paid nothing. You don't make anything out of it. There's nothing in it for you other than a triumph, a win for the organisation, for the NRL, for example. So right now, you've got Perrottet in your sights and he's got you in his sights. And he's the new kid on the block. It's important for him not to be seen as being told what to do by Commissioner for the chairman of the NRL, ARL. How's that going? How is your relationship going with the Premier?
Well, it's got to the point every time I have a conversation with him now, I reach out for a Panadol. That's how it's going. He's, as you say, he's a good guy, Dominic Perrottet, and he's a hard worker too, and he's probably a harder worker than me because he's got 7 kids. I don't know how he does it, having 7 kids and then still being the Premier of New South Wales. So his time management is probably much better than mine. Look, he's a tough negotiator, and he's trying to do the best what he believes is for New South Wales, and I'm trying to do the best for the NRL. But what I like with these sort of robust debates, and I always said when I first started any job, is you've got to lose blood for the people that you're working for, because if you're not going to prepare to lose blood, you shouldn't be there. And that's what I do. I go in there and I go hard, and because I want to get the result for that organisation that's entrusted me to represent them. And as you say, there's nothing in it for me. It's the law. I'm a very loyal person. Anyone that gives me loyalty, I give it to them back in spades. And if someone trusts me with something, I don't want to let them down. And that's what probably drives me the most, I think, is that I don't want to let people down. I don't want to let the rugby league fraternity down. I don't want to let the racing fraternity down. They've trusted me in there. Say, yes, look, I'm pretty hard. And I guess, as I said earlier, the thing is I treat everyone the same. I treat Dom Perrottet the same as anyone else. He's got 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes.
7 kids.
And 7 kids. That's probably his greatest achievement. I'll tell him that too. But and I find that works. If you treat someone exactly like you treat anyone else, you don't give them. So when he gets curt with me, I get curt back. You treat people the way they treat you. So
you call it ruthless. I mean, are you ruthless in your negotiation? Because for me, it looks like you'll pull out whatever weapon that's required to win the negotiation. And then at the end of the negotiation, assuming you win or whatever happens, you shake hands and we just get on with it. Are you that ruthless?
Now, what I do, and I think we shouldn't be telling my secrets, but is you save your bullets. Sometimes you go in there and you're not as hard as you should be, and they say, "Oh, geez, that's all right." And then the next time you go in there and you're really hard, they say, "Geez, he really wants this. He's determined on this one. Let's let it slide." So that works. So you've got to work out a strategy for each individual situation. At the moment, our argument with the state government is on suburban stadiums, because I'm a firm believer that you need tribalism in rugby league, and you want to look at Belmore Oval the other day. They got 16,000 people. You had 16,000 people at Accor Stadium, and you wouldn't know they were there. There was no atmosphere. It was dead. You take them to Combank Stadium now, and what they've done, and they've done the same thing with Allianz Stadium, so once it's opened, you're going to see a different sporting arena, and I don't know how they've done it, but they've kept the audio within the arena. So even if you might have 100 people, but it sounds like you've got 5,000 at Combank Stadium. So when COVID was on, there's only 5,000 people. But the noise that came in, because all the noise stayed within the arena, was like it was 30,000 people. And they've done the same thing, which is going to be great for the Roosters, at Allianz Stadium. And what I've discovered is Parramatta have grown a leg since they've had Combank Stadium, because they've got this great arena, et cetera. It generates but we need to do that for all the clubs. So we need Shark Park to have facilities similar. We need to have Leichhardt Oval upgraded. We need to have all these stadiums upgraded so the fans can become tribal. They can walk to the ground. I remember when I played rugby league, all I wanted to do was play at Wollongong Showground. I didn't want to play in Sydney. I just wanted to play in my local suburb, my local area, and in front of my friends and families, etc. I didn't care about Sydney. And it's the same. We've got to get kids now that want to play at Penrith Park. They want to play at Combank Stadium. They want to play at their local suburban ground. But it's not just about rugby league. It's about getting sport, getting kids to play sport, because as I said, my experience is you need to play sport. And I've got a 10-year-old boy, and he plays on a PlayStation Xbox, and he's the quietest kid you've ever seen. But once he plays Fortnite, which is that violent game, he becomes a different person. And it worries me that you see these kids now, and they're all online playing against each other on a game where to win you've got to kill someone, which to me doesn't make sense. And you wonder, all these tragedies that are occurring around the world, why are we teaching our kids that? So to me, it's important that we have these facilities and these stadiums to get the kids out and play sport. It's better for their mental well-being. It develops relationships with their mates, and because you're playing a team sport. So the suburban stadium strategy is more than just rugby league. I think it's something for the whole of the community.
Peter, can I just, hopefully you can just indulge me for a second. 5 quick questions, quick answers. Favourite drink?
Pepsi Max.
Pepsi Max. No alcohol?
No, I don't really drink, no. I'll have a beer socially, but no, I don't go home, have a wine or a beer or anything. Actually, there's this new probiotic drink that I have now, which is quite good. It's I can't remember the name of it, but otherwise it's
Pepsi Max.
Pepsi Max.
Favourite restaurant in Sydney?
Well, I used to like Pizza Hut, but it's closed down, and that was a great tragedy because as a kid, that was if I could go to Pizza Hut on a weekend, that was like lobster mornay. Now it was. So that was my favourite restaurant. And to this day, I still crave for a Pizza Hut pizza. It's quite weird, and a meat pie. So I'm not a person that goes to fancy restaurants. This nouveau cuisine rubbish, where you get one little drop and anything tastes good if it's only one little part of it. But when you have, what's the use of going to a restaurant and then have to go to McDonald's after to eat? So I'm not a big restaurant man.
Favourite past footballer, rugby league player?
There's 2, Teddy Goodwin and Graham Langland stick out for me as a kid, because, and I remember, this is why I think players are such role models. I remember Graham Langland's coming to Wollongong to coach the team I was playing for. It was like God came to Wollongong to me. I couldn't speak when he was there because he was my idol. And I don't think players realise the influence they have on these younger kids. My son is in love with James Tedesco. If James Tedesco gets a short back and sides, next week he'll get the short back and sides. He knows everything about James Tedesco. And he's just and I don't think the players realise how important they are to these young kids.
Most complex conversation or complicated conversation or difficult conversation you've had with who's the coach, which rugby league coach, current or past? You don't have to reveal the conversation, but
there's been a few.
Who's rattled you really?
None of them have rattled me, I've got to be honest. To be fair to the coaches, they've all been pretty good. They've all been pretty respectful. And once you explain to them what you're trying to do, they normally get on board. During COVID, it was funny because, I had so many meetings. Like we had 60, 70 players on these Zoom. I'd never heard of Zoom up until COVID. We'd have 70 people online and, we had every coach. And so I went through and told them the strategy. Not one coach asked a question. Out of all the coaches, you would have thought that they would have been into me about something, but they didn't. They respected it. They respected the fact that what we were trying to do. And the beauty about COVID was they saw the other side. They saw the side where there is no rugby league. So they gave me sort of latitude to bring it back because they wanted it back. And whatever it took to get it back, they supported me. And it was the same with the players. There was a couple of players that gave me, ones that didn't know basic maths, because players get paid from the 1st of October. So you take that into account. So when it came to, they were paid from October to March, but they wanted to start the year again from March. I said, no, wait a minute, you got paid from October, so they don't understand the word prepayment. So there was an argument with a couple of front rowers that, and it was quite funny because some of the players had my phone number and they would be texting me, get that imbecile a calculator or something like that. So it was quite funny because I'd be getting all these texts from the other players knocking the player that was asking the question. So. But it was so there was no real coach that gave me a hard time. Look, it's the complete opposite. As I said, I learn things every day, and Wayne Bennett was certainly been a good influence on me in a lot of ways, as has Ricky Stewart and a few of the other coaches. Craig Bellamy's a very basic, very nice human being when you get to know him, and he's what you see is what you get with him, and. All the coaches that I've dealt with have been, in their own way, very good to deal with.
I think one of the really important things for us, and I think probably everybody agrees, not just people here today, but everybody would agree, that you're going to go down as one of our greatest sports administrators, Australian sports administrators of all time. And, we've seen some good ones in the past in rugby league, like Johnny Quayle, etc. But, you're at the top level. What's important for everybody, and this is more a personal question, we want you there forever. Health. What are you doing about your health? You're 60 years of age now?
No, 45 with GST is what I say.
Okay.
These days. I told you I lie about my age now, so I'm not going to tell you.
But you're now looking at, the next 20 years. What do you do around your health? I noticed you've got an Oura ring on your head.
Look, the funny thing is I've been married for nearly on 20 years and I've never wore a wedding ring. And I'm a real tech man. I just love every new tech. So there's this new Oura ring. So I got it for the first time yesterday and I wore it today. And so I went home to my wife and said, what the hell are you wearing? You wouldn't wear a wedding ring, but you wear a tech. But what this does actually, it measures your heartbeat and your heart rate pretty well 24/7, which is one of the things I worry about when you're in these jobs is you don't realise that you're mortal like everybody else. And you could have a heart attack, and you've seen what's happened with some of our sporting people like Shane Warne, etc. And what it does is it measures your sleep and But that's one thing I do look for is my health. Is that I need to ensure because my father had 11 siblings and they all died of cancer, all 11 of them. So when you're in the racing industry, that's not a good form guide. So you need to ensure that you do go and do your checkups and you. Don't think you're indestructible because we're all destructible. And so my greatest fear at the moment is my health. And, so that's why I buy all these gadgets they're probably useless, but it psychologically gives me something to...
Well, it builds awareness.
It builds awareness, that's probably the word.
And it makes you become conscious of your health. And I think that's really important because I think we as a rugby league community in particular would want to know that Peter Liondis is going to stay doing the good job he's doing because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. I mean, I think that's probably fair to say. I want to thank you for your honesty and your frankness and everything you've said for your time in particular, but I'm going to just throw it to the audience for a few quick questions. We could have done this for 3 hours, but we don't have that much time.
Do you think kids can play too much sport?
No, I don't think so. I think there's got to be a mix between team sport and individual sport. And I don't think a child should just play an individual sport because that's what they become like in their life. I remember one of my ex-chairmen was criticising this guy and he called him the golfer. And I said, well, why do you call him the golfer? He said, because he's always playing as an individual. He's never a team player. And that sort of made me think, you do need to be part of a team. So I think in sport you should do both. You should be an individual game like a tennis player or tennis and then play into a team sport. So I don't think there's ever enough sport because sport has just so many benefits, which, it has for your physical, your mental, and your later in life. People that you're going to call upon 20, 30 years later is you meet them through sport.
You mentioned rugby league and the juniors, and what's the rugby league doing to combat the AFL with their infiltration, especially here in Sydney at school levels? You see a lot of Aussie rule goalposts going up on school grounds now. What's rugby league doing to combat that? That's
a very good question because I'm 100% agree with you. I think we were asleep in relation to the AFL. infiltrated us, but their strategy has been very smart. And I take my hat off to them, to be quite honest. What they did is they've gone and got joint ventures with the education departments. And when I was a kid, that's where I started at school. And then you go from the school to the club. So it's very, very important to have a presence in the schools. And we haven't done that for the last 5 years or 10 years. And that's really cost us. And our dropouts really happened between the ages of 13 and 18 in junior rugby league. So the first thing we've done is we've actually employed 2 ex-principals to rectify our relationship with the education department, both in Queensland and in New South Wales. So we're going to have a much greater presence at school. To give you an example, my son goes to Riverview. AFL's there with rugby union, no rugby league. Even at Hunters Hill Public School, when he was at the public school, there was no rugby league. There was AFL. And it's the same in Queensland. So we need to start from the basics and go back to the schools and get a presence with the education department. And the one thing that Wayne Pearce actually highlights is that most of the teachers now are female, and you want to start at primary school, and they're intimidated by rugby league. They don't know how to coach a rugby league team. So we need to get a program out there that makes them feel comfortable, these female primary school teachers, to coach rugby league. And rugby league's got an advantage over all other sports because you can play so many varieties of it. You can play tip, tag, and then contact. So you can start with tip and tag at school, which is not dangerous, and then work your way to contact. I'll give you an example of how we do things wrong. I was at the ANZ, the Anzac Day game between St George and the Roosters, and we had someone next door in the private suite, and he came up to me and he said, I've been banging on for a month or for years that my son goes to a private school, and the private school compels him to play on a Saturday. So rugby league in the clubs is played on a Saturday. I've asked him, change it to a Sunday and you will get so many more kids playing the game. So this is what I mean about adapting to, and not innovating, but adapting to the changes in circumstances. So one of the things we're going to look at is maybe changing it to a Sunday. So you're not competing against the private schools, rugby union games, and et cetera. But your questions are very, very relevant because that's where I think rugby league has absolutely dropped the ball.
We've got time for one more question.
What advice would you give your 25-year-old self or young entrepreneurs?
I think the advice I would give is never give up. If you believe in something and you want to achieve something, never give up. Just, I always, look, I'm human like everybody else, and in sport, in these 2 roles that I have, it's a roller coaster ride. One day you're on top of the world, you're thinking you're indestructible. The next day you're back at the bottom, and you work your way up. But the thing that I never give up. And I always say to myself, which is quite weird, dust yourself and get back up. And God, there's been a lot of dust over my lifetime. That's what I say. But so I think that's the best advice I can give any kid, anyone, is never give up. Just never, never, never give up.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to, on behalf of the Sydney Roosters and our business club members, I want to thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for your openness, your frankness, your honesty, and your generosity in terms of your time and the content you offered us today, Peter. It's been, for me, been a great revelation and a great privilege to sit here and just chew the fat and talk to you about what sort of drives Peter Liondis, and at the end of the day, hopefully we all get something out of that and we all learn from it. We can take it home and put it into our own very daily lives. Well, it's a credit to you, Mark, because I've said a lot of things today that I probably wouldn't have said in my life, and you relaxed me up here, so is there any way we can get rid of that video now? Thanks very much.